My name is Carol, and I was 32 years old when I first met Brian. We were both employed at Global Tech, a prominent international corporation. I worked there as a translator while Brian was part of the IT team, always ready with a witty remark or a helpful gesture whenever my computer acted up. It wasn't long before our casual coffee breaks evolved into romantic dinner dates, and soon we became inseparable. A year into our relationship, Brian proposed to me in our favorite park. Our wedding was a delightful affair filled with white lace and heartfelt toasts from friends and family. Brian's parents, Amanda and Frank, were very welcoming. Amanda embraced me warmly, whispering, "Welcome to the family, dear." Little did I know what that welcome would entail. After our honeymoon, Brian and I settled into his spacious, modern apartment with a stunning view of the city skyline. As I marveled at our new home, Brian excitedly showed me the kitchen, boasting about the top-of-the-line appliances his mother insisted on when he first moved in. In the whirl of our new life, I didn't ponder the significance of those words. The initial weeks were filled with joy as Brian and I found a comfortable routine, sharing household duties and savoring peaceful evenings together. However, one Saturday morning, as I tried my hand at making pancakes, I heard the front door open. Expecting Brian, I called out, but to my surprise, it was Amanda. "Oh, hello, dear," she greeted, immediately starting to tidy up, despite the place being immaculate. "I thought I'd check on how you two are settling in." Stunned, I asked how she got in. Amanda casually showed me a spare key, explaining it was necessary for her to look after her Brian. For the next hour, I endured her unsolicited advice on housekeeping. When Brian came home, his surprise mirrored mine, but he didn't challenge his mother. Over the next few weeks, Amanda's unexpected visits became frequent, each time offering unwanted critiques and recounting tales of her own experiences with her mother-in-law, seemingly unaware of the parallels to her intrusions. As I listened to her stories of past criticisms, I kept my feelings to myself, maintaining a polite facade while grappling with the irony of her anecdotes. It was a challenging adjustment, learning to navigate the dynamics of our new family relationships while trying to establish boundaries in our marriage. Despite the challenges, I persevered, but Amanda's remarks like, "Look how well Brian turned out, you should be grateful I'm not like her," only added to my frustration. The irony of being grateful while having my privacy invaded and my abilities constantly questioned was not lost on me. Over time, Amanda's visits became more frequent and her criticism sharper. She would inspect every corner for dust and rearrange the pantry, insisting she knew Brian's preferences best. Brian seemed unaware of the growing tension, always defending his mother's actions by saying she was just trying to help. But the weight of good intentions was crushing me. The constant intrusion and criticism, thinly veiled as helpful advice, became overwhelming. It all came to a breaking point one Sunday afternoon. I was busy in the kitchen when Amanda walked in unannounced, key in hand, offering to teach me how to properly plan a meal since Brian was particular about his Sunday roasts. Holding a wooden spoon, I felt a resolve building within me. This was my home, my kitchen, my marriage, and I had had enough. Taking a deep breath, I turned to face her, my voice steady. "Amanda, we need to talk." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "About what, dear?" "About boundaries and privacy," I replied. "I appreciate your intentions to help, but your unannounced visits and constant criticisms make me uncomfortable in my own home." She left abruptly, the door slamming behind her. As the sound echoed through the apartment, I felt exhausted, yet strangely exhilarated. That evening, as Brian and I sat down for dinner, I knew it was time to address the issue directly. "Brian," I started, nervously pushing my food around on my plate, "we need to talk about your mother." He sighed and set down his fork. "What's she done now?" I took a deep breath and recounted the day's events and the buildup of past incidents. As I spoke, I could see the conflict in Brian's eyes, torn between his love for his mother and his commitment to our marriage. Brian, I know your mom can be intense and she means well, but this isn't help, it's control. She comes into our home uninvited, criticizes everything I do, and makes me feel like an intruder in my own life. It has to stop. Brian ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. What do you want me to do? I need you to set boundaries with her, I said firmly. Take back her key, ask her to call before coming over, and most importantly, I need you to stand up for me when she oversteps. There was a long pause as Brian processed my words. Finally, he nodded. You're right, I'll talk to her. True to his word, Brian spoke with Amanda the next day. I wasn't present for the conversation, but according to Brian, it didn't go well. Amanda was hurt and offended, claiming we were pushing her out of our lives. However, she reluctantly agreed to our terms. For a while, things seemed to improve. Amanda's visits became less frequent and always followed a phone call. But the peace was short-lived. It started with small things. Suddenly, I found myself uninvited to Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, marking a new phase of our ongoing adjustment. When I brought up the change in family gatherings to Brian, he would just shrug uncomfortably. Mom says it's just immediate family this time, he mutters, avoiding eye contact. The breaking point arrived on Frank's, Brian's father's, birthday. Brian and I were supposed to go together, but an urgent work matter called him away last minute. He urged me to go alone, saying his dad would want to see me. With hesitation, I agreed. Arriving at their door, a gift in hand, I rang the bell. Amanda answered, her eyes narrowing. Carol, she greeted me with sugared venom. What a surprise. We weren't expecting you. This is a family gathering, and let's be honest, dear, you're not family, are you? Her words felt like a physical blow. Frozen in shock, I listened as she continued. You've made it clear you don't want me in your life, so I think it's best if you leave now. We wouldn't want any uninvited guests ruining Frank's special day. Just then, Frank appeared behind her, puzzled by the confrontation. What's going on? He asked, looking between us. Amanda's demeanor shifted instantly. Her voice trembled theatrically. Oh, Frank, Carol was just leaving. Isn't it awful how she's pushed me out of Brian's life? She's taken away my keys, forbidden me from visiting my son. I felt my cheeks flush with anger and humiliation, but before I could defend myself, Frank intervened. That's enough, Amanda, he said sternly. Carol is family and she's welcome here. He then turned to me, his gaze softening. Please come in, Carol. We'd love to have you join us. Grateful and relieved, I followed him into the living room, feeling the curious stares of other guests. Over the next few years, my relationship with Amanda remained tense, a constant battle despite our efforts to establish boundaries. Then, tragedy struck. Frank fell ill suddenly, and his condition rapidly deteriorated. When he passed away, it seemed as though the world shifted on its axis. The funeral was a somber affair, with Amanda going through the motions, barely acknowledging me. After the service, Frank's lawyer, Mr. Raymond, a kind man and close friend of the family, approached us. Mrs. Walker, if you and your son could join me in private, Mr. Walker left some specific instructions regarding his will. When they emerged, the atmosphere had drastically changed. Amanda looked pale and shocked. Brian seemed confused. As we drove home, Brian finally broke the silence. Dad left everything to me, he whispered. The house, the savings, everything, even Mom's house. I was stunned. But why? Brian shook his head. The lawyer didn't explain. I recalled Amanda's reaction. Disbelief and anger had flashed across her face, and I thought I heard her mutter, "That fool," before she composed herself. The next day, Amanda called Brian, her voice shaking. Brian, you're not going to kick me out, are you? This house is all I have left of your father. Brian's response was immediate. Of course not, Mom. The house is yours to live in, and I'll set up a monthly allowance for you. I didn't object. It was Brian's inheritance, his decision. and despite our differences, I couldn't imagine leaving Amanda homeless after she had lost her husband. However, our act of kindness did little to soften Amanda's attitude towards me. She stopped coming to our house, but the underlying tension remained, a reminder of the complicated layers within our family dynamics. Amanda's influence remained pervasive. She frequently called Brian, always presenting some emergency or another that required his immediate attention. A leaking sink, strange noises in the attic, or sudden bouts of illness that left her feeling too unwell to be alone. Brian, always the devoted son, would rush to her side, often staying overnight. This pattern left me feeling isolated and strained our relationship further. As Amanda's birthday neared, I braced myself for yet another exclusion. For the last 3 years, I had been pointedly uninvited from family gatherings, relegated to the role of an outsider in my marriage. So, when Brian announced he was leaving for a last-minute business trip, I prepared for a quiet evening alone. Surprisingly, the day before Amanda's birthday, my phone rang, and it was Amanda herself. "Hello, Carol dear." Her voice oozed sweetness through the speaker. "I'm calling about my birthday celebration tomorrow. I know we've had our differences, but I'm tired of all this hostility. I'd like us to reconcile." Stunned, I held the phone tighter. "You want me to come to your birthday party?" "Of course, dear. I know Brian can't make it, but I'd love to see you there. What do you say?" Part of me wanted to refuse outright. After years of snubs and thinly veiled insults, it was hard to believe this sudden offer of an olive branch. Yet Amanda's voice sounded so sincere, so warm, that I found myself wavering. "I suppose I could stop by," I found myself saying. "Wonderful," Amanda exclaimed. "It's at the Willow Creek Club. I'll see you at 8. The next evening, I drove to the country club, a carefully chosen gift and a bouquet beside me. Approaching the entrance, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I pulled up to the security barrier where a guard stepped out. "Name, please?" "Carol Walker," I replied, trying to sound confident. The guard scanned his list, then frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see that name here." "There must be some mistake," I insisted. "Amanda Walker invited me personally. I'm her daughter-in-law." The guard shook his head. "I'm sorry, but if you're not on the list, I can't let you in. It's a private event." Flustered, I got out of my car and dialed Amanda. After a few rings, she picked up. "Amanda, it's Carol. I'm at the entrance, but they won't let me in." A few minutes later, Amanda approached the barrier, surrounded by a group of well-dressed guests. They were all laughing, glasses in hand, clearly enjoying the party already in full swing. As Amanda neared, I expected her to resolve the misunderstanding. Instead, she fixed me with a cold stare that sent chills down my spine. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "if it isn't the little gold digger herself, did you really think I'd let trash like you into my birthday celebration?" I stood there, stunned, as Amanda continued her tirade. "I specifically chose this venue to keep out unwanted elements like you. Why are you even here? You're not family. You're just a money-hungry woman who trapped my son." The guests behind her tittered, clearly entertained by the spectacle. I felt my face burn with humiliation and anger. The confrontation at the gate was yet another calculated humiliation, a stark reminder of the deep-seated animosity Amanda harbored toward me, despite her momentary pretense of reconciliation. "But you invited me?" I stammered, disbelief coloring my tone. "You said you wanted to reconcile." Amanda's laugh was cold and scornful. "Oh, you poor, naive girl. I wanted to see just how desperate you were to get your hands on our family's money. And look at you, showing up like a stray dog begging for scraps." For a moment, I stood face to face with Amanda, the malice clear in her eyes. Then, with deliberate calm, I dropped the flowers and gift at her feet. Without another word, I got back into my car and drove away, Amanda's mocking laughter and the distant sounds of the party fading behind me. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning from the cruelty of Amanda's words and actions. As soon as I entered our home, I collapsed onto the couch and, with trembling hands, called Brian. Through tears, I recounted the entire humiliating ordeal. Brian listened in stunned silence, only speaking to ask for details. After I finished, there was a heavy pause. Then Brian's voice, low and angry, broke the silence. "I'm coming home, and then I'm going to have a very serious conversation with my mother." True to his word, Brian was on the next flight home. When he arrived, he held me close, apologizing repeatedly for his mother's behavior. With the resolve in his eyes, he picked up the phone to call Amanda. I could hear her defensive, shrill voice through the speaker, but Brian's responses were firm and resolute. "No, Mom, this time you've gone too far. I don't want to hear your excuses. You humiliated my wife, the woman I love. No, I'm done. I'm cutting you off. No more allowance, no more help. You're on your own." For a week, we enjoyed a peace we hadn't known in years. There were no frantic calls from Amanda, no emergencies requiring Brian's immediate attention. It felt like we could finally breathe, but it couldn't last. One afternoon, there was a knock at our door. When I opened it, I found Amanda standing there, her eyes red and puffy, her appearance disheveled. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed, pushing past me into the house. "I raised that boy. I devoted my entire life to him, and now because of you, he's left me with nothing. No money, no support. I can barely afford to eat." She paced the living room, her voice rising hysterically. "It's all your fault. You turned him against me. You're the reason Frank disinherited me. You've ruined everything." I tried to interject to defend myself, but Amanda was beyond reason. She continued her tirade, tears streaming down her face until she finally collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. After a few minutes, Amanda composed herself and left without another word, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room, confused and conflicted. As the door closed behind her, I made a decision. I needed answers, and I knew just who might have them. The next day, I found myself sitting across from Frank's lawyer, Mr. Raymond, in his office. The room was warm and inviting, lined with shelves full of law books and framed diplomas on the walls. Mr. Raymond looked at me with kind eyes, his hands folded on the desk between us. "Mrs. Walker," he began, "I understand you have some questions about your father-in-law's will." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I do. I need to understand why Frank left everything to Brian and nothing to Amanda. It just doesn't make sense." Mr. Raymond leaned back in his chair, his expression conflicted. He seemed to be carefully considering his words. "Mrs. Walker, I've known the family for a long time," he started, ready to shed light on the deep-seated family secrets that had led to this moment. Mr. Raymond looked gravely serious as he prepared to disclose something significant. "What I'm about to tell you isn't pleasant," he warned. I braced myself, but nothing could prepare me for what came next. Amanda had been unfaithful to Frank, he revealed. My shock was palpable. My jaw literally dropped. "She had a lover," Mr. Raymond continued, "a man who passed away shortly before Frank. This man left Amanda a substantial amount of property in his will." I sat there, stunned, as he went on. The revelation hit hard. Frank discovered the affair and the inheritance, leading to a fierce argument that prompted him to change his will, leaving everything to Brian. But the bombshells didn't stop there. "There's more," Mr. Raymond added, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "Years ago, when Brian was just a boy, Frank's mother, Brian's grandmother, fell ill. She had saved diligently for a private nursing home to live out her final days in comfort." A pit of dread formed in my stomach as he continued. Amanda persuaded Frank to sell his mother's property and instead placed her in a state-run facility. They pocketed the money for themselves and seldom visited the poor woman. She died alone and neglected. The sick feeling in my gut intensified. The Amanda I knew, already manipulative and harsh, was revealing herself to be profoundly callous in ways I hadn't imagined. "Frank carried that guilt with him for years," Mr. Raymond said softly. Changing his will was his way of trying to make things right, to ensure that Amanda couldn't inflict on Brian what she had done to his mother. Leaving Mr. Raymond's office, my mind was spinning. The woman who had accused me of being a gold digger had been the real predator all along, pursuing her self-interests at the expense of her family's well-being and happiness. That evening, when Brian returned from work, I sat him down and shared everything I had learned from Mr. Raymond. Brian listened in stunned silence, his expression a mix of disbelief, anger, and profound sadness. "I can't believe it," he whispered after I finished, his voice barely audible. "All these years she's been lying to us, manipulating us." We stayed up late into the night discussing the implications of these revelations. Brian was devastated but resolute. "This ends now," he said firmly. We didn't have to wait long for Amanda to make her next move. A few days later, she appeared at our door, tears streaming down her face, pleading for help. "Brian," she began, her voice quivering, "I know you're angry, but please, I need your help. I have nothing left." Brian's face was stone-like as he responded, "That's not true, is it, Mom? We know about your lover, about the property and money he left you." Amanda's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" she faltered. "Drop the act," Brian said, his voice cold. "We know everything. About your affair, about what you did to Grandma, all of it." In an instant, Amanda's demeanor changed. The pitiful, pleading woman vanished, replaced by the calculating, angry figure I recognized all too well, ready to lash out. This confrontation marked a turning point, exposing the depth of deceit we had been subjected to and setting the stage for a necessary but painful realignment of our family dynamics. "How dare you!" she yelled, her voice echoing through the room, her anger directed at Brian. "After everything I've done for you, you ungrateful, selfish boy." But Brian stood his ground, calm and unyielding. "Yes, I am ungrateful," he admitted quietly. "But unlike you, I have no intention of sending you to some impersonal state nursing home to spend your last days alone." Amanda recoiled as if struck, the sting of his words palpable. Brian continued, his voice even. "I've decided to sell the house. It's time for you to move on. Use the funds and the property your lover left you, and stop manipulating those around you." Amanda's outraged cries might have reached the entire neighborhood, yet Brian was resolute. He gave her a deadline to leave, and soon after, true to his word, he sold the house. We later found out that Amanda had taken up residence in the apartment her late lover had bequeathed her, even going so far as to evict the current tenants and pay a significant sum to break their lease. Amanda attempted to contact Brian several times, oscillating between tearful appeals and furious reproaches, but we remained steadfast in our decision to sever ties. As we moved beyond that turbulent chapter, Brian and I began to look forward with optimism. I was expecting a child, and we decided to sell our apartment and search for a cozy house where we could nurture our growing family away from the dark echoes of the past. We were cautious, ensuring no news of the pregnancy or our relocation plans reached Amanda. The last thing we desired was for her to worm her way back into our lives, particularly with a child on the horizon. Driving toward our new home, I felt a surge of hope that had eluded me for years. Despite the obstacles we might encounter, I knew that Brian and I, fortified by the trials we had endured, were ready to face them together.